In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul talks about basically going to heaven. He talks about this incredible experience he has. He says, I don't know if I was in my body or out of my body, but I was caught up into paradise. And it must have been pretty amazing because he says, I would rather be there. I would rather be with Christ. But he says, nevertheless, I am choosing to stay in my flesh because it's better for you that I stay here. So he chooses to stay in his body for the benefit of his disciples. And if you continue through the rest of that chapter, it's very interesting because he says, I'm not going to boast in these revelations I've had. I've heard things in heaven. I mean, I can just imagine Paul telling this story to his disciples, and he's going, man, I could tell you some amazing stories. I could blow your mind with this revelation that I've got because I've been to heaven, man. Let me tell you one thing. It is amazing. And I hear this subtle issue that he's struggling with inwardly of pride, as you read through it, and especially when he prays later. Let me tell you what I mean by that. So he says, I'm not going to boast in that. I could boast in that, but rather I'm going to boast in my weakness. So it's almost like he's reining himself in. There's a potential to be prideful, to blow people away with the revelation, because that's what he says. He says I could go on about this revelation. I could boast in these revelations, but I'm going to boast in my weakness. And so there's just a very interesting psychological mechanism that is at work here, that he reins himself in. And then we see right after he's telling this, and he says he's choosing to stay in the flesh, to be here, to strengthen the church. There's a messenger of Satan that comes to buffet Paul. And he says, this messenger of Satan came to keep me from being exalted because of these great and wonderful revelations that I have. So, you got to think through a couple of things. And then he prays, God, please take this messenger away. Please take this thorn in my flesh away. Some people say that the thorn in the flesh was an illness. I don't. I think it was, either this woman that was following him around in Acts 16, kind of hyping him up. This is Paul. This is the man of God. This is the one that's showing you the way of salvation, sent from God. And, he discerns that that's a woman possessed with the spirit of divination. But I kind of see a connection between those two. This messenger of Satan, this thorn in the flesh, historically, when you look at the idea of a thorn in the flesh, it's people. It's a people group. Now, Paul could be referring to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin coming along and undermining his work and seeking to arrest him and stone him and keep him from proclaiming and preaching the gospel. It could be that. Could be a few things. But the issue at hand here is Paul's pride. And this messenger comes and attacks Paul to exploit his weakness. Now, just follow me on this here for just a minute. We see kind of the same thing with Job. Job says, that which I feared the most has come upon me. Well, what did Job fear? Job feared losing his family. And that's what happened, that which he feared the most. And we have the story of Satan going to God. You got to remember in that story, Satan is a deceiver. You can't read that story of Satan approaching the throne of God as if it's two equals having an even keel conversation. In other words, a conversation where you can just trust what both are saying at face value. The enemy is always seeking to manipulate. So then we see Job pray, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, which later he admitted he was wrong. He said, I didn't know what I was talking about, which that's a whole nother subject. But the point is, Job was attacked in the area of his weakness by the enemy in his family. That which I feared the most came upon me. Well, so then you see the same tactic with Paul from the enemy. The enemy came to attack and exploit Paul's pride, his potential pride. Paul's telling you, I could be prideful in this. I could boast in these revelations that I have. And then you see this messenger from Satan coming and attacking Paul in that very same area, the area of pride. And the enemy does not want Paul to be exalted and lifted up. And here's a key too. The enemy also knows that pride comes before a fall. Pride comes before destruction. So what's the enemy doing? He's trying to hype Paul up. He's trying to get him prideful. He's trying to get him boastful in these revelations because he knows that that's going to bring a fall. But Paul spots it, gets ahead of it, and he says, no, I'm not going to boast in that stuff. I'm not going to get in prideful. I'm not going to be prideful about this. But God, would you help me? Would you take away this messenger that's trying to exploit my pride? And God says, what does he say? My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength or my power is made perfect in weakness. Now, depending on your theological perspective, you might hear that as a no. So in other words, Paul prays, God, would you help me? And then you might hear God say no. But that's not what he's saying. My grace is sufficient for you is not a no. My grace is sufficient for you is a solution. So a little bit deeper into that, God says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So we see that God equates grace to power, grace to strength. Grace is not mercy. Mercy is God not treating you justly, or that's not the best way to say it. God not punishing you or treating you based on your merit, based on your behavior. Mercy is when God forgives you when you don't deserve it. Grace is not mercy. It is conflated, unfortunately, in the body of Christ a lot, but grace is power. Grace is strength. There's lots of different dictionaries and lexicons and concordances out there that kind of build unfortunately, there's no one dictionary that kind of has a full rounded picture of what grace is, but you kind of put them all together and you see that grace is unmerited favor. Grace is divine influence on the heart. Grace is capacity. So you kind of put all this together and you see that grace is strength. Grace is power. We don't live under sin because we live under grace. That doesn't mean that you should just continue in sin because God's going to forgive you, because that's not what grace means. Grace means power. So to live under grace and not sin is to live under the strength of God inwardly and not the lure of sin. So back to Paul. God tells Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect, or it comes to fruition. It becomes mature in weakness. So, what's the big takeaway here? God's not going to send the enemy into your life to keep you humble. The enemy will exploit you in your weakness. But if you recognize the tactics of the enemy and you recognize that the enemy is going to come and exploit you where you're weak, man, we should rejoice because it's an opportunity to walk in grace. It's an opportunity to yield to God inwardly, who will not abandon us, who will freely give us grace. How much more, under the new covenant, should we experience mercy and forgiveness from God, but also be supplied with grace? And I just think about, I just see the potential for Paul to get prideful and blow us away with his revelation. And then you watch how the rest of that chapter unfolds. So, I hope that encourages you. I hope that gives you, sorry for the shaky camera here, but sitting outside and just holding it. But, I hope that gives you a little bit of insight in how the enemy works. And I hope it gives you a little bit more insight in what grace is. And I hope that helps you humble yourself in the areas where you could lean on your own strength and you could get boastful and prideful. And, I have to admit, wouldn't it be cool to hear Paul say what he heard up there? We got to watch out for these hyper-charismatic types that are always talking about these encounters and visitations that they have with God. I just don't know that we can fully grasp and understand that eternal spiritual dimension on this side. We walk to enter his kingdom. But that's not what this video is about. I wanted to encourage you. God's not going to tell you no when you're weak. He's going to help you. He's going to be there. And he's not going to send the enemy into your life. The enemy comes to exploit your weakness. So know yourself. Know where you have potential weakness. Know where you have potential areas to be prideful or maybe fall into the trap of sin, and choose to feed on the power of grace, because it is sufficient. Way beyond, where sin abounds, where the opportunity for sin is, there's much more supply of grace. Choose to live under the power of grace, to walk free from the tactics of the enemy, to walk free from the weaknesses of your flesh, and watch his strength be perfected in your life. I hope this is helpful to you. Hey, also too, let me know how the sound is on this, your experience with this video. I want to start putting more videos onto this channel. A lot of times when I have thoughts in the spur of the moment, I don't have time to jump into a studio type setting to get recorded, and I want to capture kind of that just that freshness of the moment. So let me know how this video works for you, if it sounds good for you, and I appreciate it. Love you guys. Appreciate you. Give me a comment down below, like, subscribe, all that stuff, share. Appreciate your support. More and more stuff at my website, clintbyars.com. Let me hear from you below. God bless you guys.